The advertisement in the asterisk Territorial Gazette promised a home, 2 meals daily, and $50 a year. Not a husband with the eyes of a man who'd forgotten how to hope. Nora Calloway stepped off the stagecoach into the bone-white dust of Kemper's Ridge with one carpet bag, a worn Bible that had been her mother's, and the sick certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. The town looked like God had started building it, then lost interest halfway through. Wooden storefronts leaned against each other like drunks, their paint peeling in long grey strips. A water trough sat empty in front of the mercantile, its bottom cracked into a spiderweb of dried mud. 3 men loitered outside the saloon, watching her with the kind of attention that made her skin prickle. She'd expected someone to meet her. The letter from Mr. Jacob Brennan had been specific. Arrive on the afternoon stage, 2nd Tuesday of June. I will be waiting. But the only person who approached was a boy, maybe 10 years old, all gangly limbs and sun-darkened skin. He wore breeches held up with a length of rope and a shirt that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric had looked like. His feet were bare, toes dusty and tough-looking. "You Miss Calloway?" he asked, squinting up at her. "I am. Pa sent me, says to bring you out to the ranch." The boy grabbed her carpet bag before she could protest, stumbling slightly under its weight. "I'm Daniel, that's our wagon." He jerked his chin toward a buckboard that had seen better decades. The horse hitched to it looked patient and ancient, its muzzle flecked with white. Nora followed Daniel across the street, aware of the men still watching, their conversation dying as she passed. The ride out took the better part of an hour. Daniel didn't talk much, just pointed out landmarks, a lightning-struck pine, a creek that ran dry most summers, the boundary line of Brennan land marked by a cairn of stacked stones. The landscape stretched in every direction, endless grass broken by outcroppings of red rock and stunted junipers. The sky was so big it made Nora feel like a speck of dust, insignificant and easily blown away. "How old's your brother?" she asked, remembering the letter had mentioned 2 boys. "Sam's 7, he don't talk much." "Doesn't," Nora corrected gently. Daniel shot her a look that might have been resentment or might have been something else. "Ma used to say that too." The words hung between them, awkward and painful. Nora had known the boy's mother was dead. It was the whole reason she'd answered the advertisement, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. These weren't abstract children in need of care. They were flesh and blood boys who'd lost something they'd never get back. The Brennan ranch appeared gradually, resolving from the heat shimmer like a mirage gaining substance. The house was small but solid, built from logs chinked with mud and whitewash. A barn stood behind it, listing slightly to one side. Chickens pecked in a yard enclosed by a split-rail fence. Laundry hung motionless on a line, bone dry and waiting. A man emerged from the barn as they pulled up. Jacob Brennan looked different than Nora had imagined. Older, for one thing, probably pushing 40. Tall and lean, with dark hair going grey at the temples and a face carved down to its essential angles by sun and wind. He wore work clothes stained with what looked like axle grease, and he wiped his hands on a rag as he approached. "Miss Calloway," his voice was low, rough-edged. "Good, you made it." She waited for something more, a welcome, maybe, or an acknowledgement that this was strange for both of them. Instead, he nodded toward the house. "Boys'll show you where things are. Supper's at 6. I've got to finish with the wagon wheel." He turned and walked back to the barn without another word. Nora stood there, dust settling on her traveling dress, and felt the full weight of what she'd done. She'd come 800 miles to marry a man who couldn't spare 5 minutes to look at her properly. A man whose advertisement had promised a asterisk housekeeper position, nothing more, but whose neighbors had informed her through carefully worded letters that widowers in these parts expected more than just cleaned floors and hot meals. "He isn't always like this," Daniel said quietly. "He's just been different since Ma died." The house smelled like coffee and old smoke, and something indefinably male. Daniel led her through a main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner. A rough-hewn table with 4 mismatched chairs sat in the center. The walls were bare, except for a single daguerreotype in a tarnished frame, a woman with serious eyes and dark hair pulled back severely. "That's Ma," Daniel said, following her gaze. "Sarah Brennan, she died having Sam." "Sam's 7, Nora said slowly. "Pa kept her after. We didn't have money for the doctor until it was too late. Blood poisoning, they said." Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Pa doesn't like talking about it." A smaller boy appeared in the doorway of what must have been a bedroom. He had the same dark coloring as his brother, but where Daniel was all sharp edges and barely contained energy, Sam was soft and watchful. He stared at Nora with huge eyes, thumb halfway to his mouth, before he seemed to remember he was too old for that. "Sam, this is Miss Calloway," Daniel said. "She's going to be staying with us." Sam nodded, but didn't speak. Nora spent the rest of the afternoon trying to make sense of the chaos. The house was clean enough, someone had been sweeping and wiping surfaces, but it had the hollow feeling of a place where people existed rather than lived. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softness anywhere. The pantry held basics: flour, salt, dried beans, a little coffee. The bedroom the boys shared was tiny, just big enough for a double bed they apparently shared and a crate that held their few clothes. The third bedroom, the one that had clearly belonged to Jacob and Sarah, was shut tight. Daniel caught her looking at it. "Pa sleeps in the barn now, been that way for a year." She cooked supper using what she found: beans seasoned with a little salt pork, cornbread, weak coffee. Jacob came in exactly at 6, washed at the basin by the door, and sat down without comment. The boys sat too. All three of them stared at their plates while Nora served. The silence was suffocating. "This is good, ma'am," Daniel finally said. "Thank you, Daniel." Jacob ate mechanically, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He had good hands, Nora noticed, broad across the palm, long-fingered, scarred from years of hard work. A white line ran across his left knuckles where something had healed badly. He caught her looking and tucked his hands into his lap. After supper he stood. "Boys, get your chores done. Miss Calloway, a word." They went out onto the porch. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting everything gold and amber. Jacob leaned against the railing, his back to her. "I'll be direct," he said. "You came here thinking one thing and I advertised another. That's my fault. I should have been clearer in the letter." Nora's stomach dropped. "You don't want?" "I need help with the boys and the house. The ranch is more than I can manage alone, and Daniel's been trying to be the man of the place since he was 9 years old. It ain't fair to him." Jacob turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes were the culk of smoke. "But I can't ask you to just be a housekeeper. People talk. They'll talk about you, and they'll talk about my boys. I won't have Sam and Daniel growing up with folks whispering that their father's living in sin." "What are you proposing?" "Marriage, legal and proper," but he stopped, seeming to search for words. "I ain't looking for what a marriage usually means. You'd have your own space. No expectations beyond taking care of the house and the boys. You'd be safe here." Safe, it was such a strange word coming from him, as if he thought that's what she'd been worried about. Nora looked past him at the land rolling away in every direction, at the sky going purple at its edges, at the barn, where this man apparently slept rather than face the bedroom where his wife had died. "Why did you advertise for a housekeeper if you meant to find a wife?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I didn't think any woman would come if I was honest, who'd want to marry a man with 2 half-wild boys and a failing ranch. And yet here I am. Here you are." They stood there as the last light bled from the sky. Somewhere a coyote yuppered, and the chickens rustled nervously in their coop. Nora thought about the boarding house in Sunt, Louis, where she'd been living, 3 women to a room, working 14 hours a day in a laundry that turned her hands red and raw. She thought about the man who'd managed the place, whose eyes had started lingering too long, whose excuses to brush past her in narrow spaces had become too frequent. She thought about the advertisement she'd answered: "Widower seeks housekeeper. 2 boys, ages 7 and 10, room and board plus $50 annually, must be of good moral character. No excessive drinking or loose behavior." She'd written back thinking it meant escape. Maybe it still did, just not the kind she'd imagined. "I'll marry you," she said, "but I want one thing clear. Those boys deserve a mother who sees them, not just someone who cooks and cleans. If I'm going to be here, I'm going to be Asterisk her, not a ghost in your dead wife's house. Something flickered across Jacob's face, surprise, maybe, or the faintest hint of approval. Fair enough. We'll ride to town tomorrow. Reverend Michaels will do the ceremony. He went back inside, leaving Nora alone on the porch. The night wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and dust and something green from the creek bed. Above her, stars were beginning to emerge, more than she'd ever seen in the city, so many they looked like spilled sugar across dark cloth. She'd come here with $300 that Jacob had sent for traveling expenses. That money was supposed to be a bride price, though he'd never called it that. Now it sat in her carpet bag, feeling like a weight around her neck, proof that she'd been bought, in a way, even if neither of them wanted to acknowledge it. The wedding took place in Reverend Michael's front parlor with Mrs. Michaels and the boys as witnesses. Nora wore her best dress, grey wool that was too hot for June, but the closest thing she had to finery. Jacob wore a clean shirt and actually combed his hair. Sam held a bouquet of wildflowers Daniel had picked that morning, black-eyed Susans and prairie roses, already wilting in the heat. The Reverend's words washed over her: love, honor, cherish, till death do you part. She said, I do, when prompted. Jacob's voice was steady when he did the same. He slipped a ring onto her finger, too large, obviously Sarah's, but he'd wrapped thread around the band to make it fit. The metal was still warm from his pocket. You may kiss the bride, Reverend Michaels said, with the slightly awkward cheer of someone who suspected this marriage wasn't quite what it seemed. Jacob leaned in and brushed his lips against Nora's cheek, so quickly and chastely it barely counted. His breath smelled like mint. He'd been chewing it on the ride over, probably nervous. The realization that he was nervous made her feel slightly better. They signed the certificate. Mrs. Michaels served lemonade and sugar cookies. Sam ate 3 cookies without saying a word, while Daniel made stilted conversation about the weather. Then it was done, and they were climbing back into the wagon, a married couple returning to their ranch, except nothing about it felt real. The first weeks had a strange, suspended quality. Nora fell into the rhythms of the household: wake before dawn, stoke the fire, make breakfast, pack lunch for Jacob to take to whatever part of the ranch needed work. The boys were easier than she'd expected. Daniel was hungry for attention, any kind of attention, and responded to even her smallest gestures of care, like a plant towards sunlight. Sam was harder to reach, but she noticed he started leaving little gifts on the kitchen table: a smooth stone, a particularly nice feather, once a whole bird's nest, empty and perfect. Jacob remained distant. He worked from dawn till dark, came in only for meals, said little beyond what was necessary. At night, Nora would see lamplight in the barn sometimes, burning late. She wondered what he did out there, if he slept at all, or just sat in the dark with his ghosts. One evening, Daniel came running into the house, face flushed with panic. Miss Nora, Sam fell in the creek. He's coughing something awful. She found Sam on the creek bank, soaked and shivering, his lips tinged blue despite the summer heat. He must have gone under inhaled water. She wrapped him in her shawl and carried him back to the house, surprised by how light he was, too light for a 7-year-old. When had he last eaten properly? She stripped off his wet clothes and rubbed him down, wrapped him in blankets, held him while he coughed and coughed. Daniel hovered anxiously. Should I get Pa? Not yet. Help me heat water for tea. Sam finally stopped coughing and fell asleep against her shoulder, exhausted. His hair smelled like creek water and little boy sweat. Nora sat there holding him, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong against her chest, and something in her own chest cracked open. This was real. These boys were real. This strange, cobbled-together family was becoming something she couldn't just walk away from. Jacob came in near midnight and stopped short when he saw them. Nora in the rocking chair, Sam asleep in her arms, Daniel curled at her feet. He fell in the creek, she said softly. He's all right now. Jacob knelt beside Sam, checking him with the careful efficiency of someone who'd probably doctored animals and children both. Satisfied, he straightened. I'll take him to bed. I can. You've done enough. He scooped Sam up gently, cradling him like Sam weighed nothing. Over his shoulder, he added, "Thank you." It was the first time he'd thanked her for anything beyond cooking. The next afternoon, Nora found curtain fabric and a sewing kit waiting on the kitchen table. No note, but she knew who'd left them. She smiled despite herself and got to work. The turning point came in August. Jacob's brother arrived from Cheyenne, a man named Thomas, smooth-talking and well-dressed, everything Jacob wasn't. He stayed for 3 days, and Nora watched Jacob become increasingly tense, shoulders rigid whenever Thomas was in the room. On the last evening, she overheard them arguing behind the barn. "You're drowning out here, Jake. Sell me the ranch. Take the boys somewhere civilized. Hell, with what I'd pay, you could start over anywhere. This is our home. This is your grave. Sarah's been gone 7 years." "Don't," Jacob's voice was dangerous. "Don't say her name. Someone needs to. You've been half dead since she passed, and those boys are growing up wild. Now you've got some mail-order bride playing house." The crack of fist-hitting flesh was loud in the quiet evening. Nora flinched. There was scuffling, Thomas cursing, then his voice again, thick with blood. "You always were a fool, Jake. Die out here if you want, but don't take those boys down with you." Thomas left before dawn the next morning. Jacob had bruised knuckles and wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. The boys were subdued, aware that something had shattered even if they didn't understand what. Nora found Jacob in the barn that night, sitting on an overturned crate in the dark. "May I come in?" He shrugged. She sat on a hay bale, letting her eyes adjust. In the dimness, she could make out his profile, the strong nose, the hard line of his jaw, the way his shoulders curved inward, as if trying to protect something vital. "Your brother's wrong," she said, "about the boys. They're not growing up wild, they're growing up strong. You've been here 2 months, you don't know. I know Daniel reads to Sam every night from that old McGuffey reader, even though half the pages are missing. I know Sam leaves me presents because he doesn't have words for what he feels. I know they love you so much it hurts them that you're hurting." Jacob's hands clenched on his knees. "I can't," he stopped, started again. "I can't be what they need. I couldn't save Sarah. I can barely keep this place running. Some days I think Thomas is right, that I'm just being stubborn, holding on to something that should have died with her." "Is that what you want, to let it all die?" "I don't know what I want anymore." Nora stood and moved closer, close enough that she could have touched him if she'd been brave enough. "Then let me tell you what I see. I see a man who's been carrying grief so long he's forgotten it's not the same as living. I see boys who need their father, not his ghost. And I see a ranch that could thrive if someone would stop punishing himself long enough to actually work on it." "I brought you here under false pretenses," Jacob said, his voice raw. "You deserve better than this." "Maybe, but I'm here anyway, and I'm not going anywhere." He looked up at her then, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. His eyes were wet. "Why?" "Because someone has to fight for this family, and if you won't do it, then I will." Something broke in him. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against her stomach, and she felt his shoulders shake with silent sobs. Nora put her hand on his head, running her fingers through his hair, and let him cry. Let him release 7 years of grief and guilt and loneliness. When he finally pulled away, his face was blotchy and his eyes were red, but he looked more alive than she'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be, just be here, be present. The rest will come." After that night, things changed. Slowly at first, like ice melting at the edges of a pond. Jacob started coming to dinner on time. He taught Daniel to shoe a horse and let Sam help with small tasks, even when it would have been faster to do them himself. He still slept in the barn, but some nights Nora would see him standing on the porch, looking at the house like he was trying to remember what it felt like to belong inside it. One evening in late September, with the first hints of autumn crisping the air, Nora finished hanging laundry and found Jacob waiting by the clothesline. "Walk with me," he asked. They walked without speaking, following the creek up into the hills. The land rolled out around them, grass turning gold, the sky going purple and orange where the sun was setting. Jacob led her to a spot where a stand of cottonwoods grew around a small spring. "This is where I asked Sarah to marry me," he said. "Seems right to bring you here too." Nora's throat tightened. "Jacob, I know what I said when you came, about expectations, about keeping distance." He turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes were impossibly soft. "I was wrong, not about wanting to protect you, that was real, but I thought if I kept you at arm's length, it wouldn't hurt when you left. Turns out it hurts worse watching you be kind to my sons and fix my house and try to reach me when I've done everything I can to push you away. I'm not leaving. I know that's what scares me." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "I'm not good at this anymore, at feeling things, at letting people in, but I want to try, if you'll be patient with me." "I'm not going anywhere," Nora repeated. "Not today, not tomorrow, not when things are hard. You're stuck with me, Jacob Brennan." He smiled, actually smiled, and it transformed his face. "I can live with that." He kissed her then, properly this time, and it was nothing like their wedding peck. It was tentative and honest and full of possibility. When they broke apart, Nora was breathless. "The boys are going to need to know things are changing," Jacob said. "They already know. Children always know." They walked back as darkness fell, his hand warm in hers. That night, for the first time since Sarah's death, Jacob Brennan slept in his own house. Not in the bedroom he'd shared with his first wife. Nora had quietly converted that into a sewing room weeks ago, but in the small room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the following months, the ranch began to shift from survival to something that might actually be called prosperity. Jacob fixed the barn's lean, replaced the cracked water trough, mended fences that had been sagging for years. Nora planted a garden and put up preserves for winter. Daniel started attending the school in town 3 days a week, riding there on the old horse. Sam gradually began to speak, first single words, then sentences, then actual conversations, his voice high and sweet. Christmas came, their first together as a family. They couldn't afford much, but Jacob carved a set of toy horses for the boys, and Nora made them new shirts from fabric she'd saved up for. Daniel gave her a drawing he'd done of the house, with all 4 of them standing in front of it, and Sam gave Jacob a rock painted with crude but recognizable horses. In the spring, when the grass turned green and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Nora realized she was pregnant. She told Jacob one evening while they sat on the porch watching the sunset, something that had become their ritual. He was quiet for a long time, his hand tightening on hers. "Are you frightened?" he finally asked. "Yes." "Me too." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But we'll get through it, together." And they did. When the time came, with Mrs. Michaels attending and Jacob packing outside like a caged animal, Nora delivered a healthy baby girl. They named her Sarah Rose, Sarah for the woman who'd come before, Rose for new beginnings. Daniel and Sam were besotted with their baby sister, handling her with exaggerated care, arguing over who got to hold her. Jacob held her like she was made of glass and magic, tears streaming down his face, all his ghosts finally laid to rest. Years later, when people asked Nora about her marriage, about how she'd ended up in Kemper's Ridge with a reformed widower and his half-wild boys, she would smile and say it was simpler than it seemed. She'd answered an advertisement for a housekeeper and found a family instead. Found a man who'd forgotten how to live and 2 boys who needed someone to fight for them. Found a place where the sky went on forever and the work was hard and the winters were brutal, but where love, when it finally came, was worth every mile she'd traveled to find it. And if people thought there was more to the story, whispers about the $300, about the hasty wedding, about the widow's ring Nora wore on a chain around her neck rather than on her finger, well, that was their business. The truth was simpler and more complicated than gossip could capture. The truth was that she'd bought her way into this family with money and determination, and they'd bought their way into her heart with need and hope, and the slow, painful work of learning to trust again. On summer evenings, Nora would stand on the porch with baby Sarah on her hip, watching Jacob and the boys work in the corral, and feel something settle deep in her chest. This ramshackle ranch in the middle of nowhere, this man with his scarred hands and healing heart, these boys who called her ma now without hesitation, this baby who'd never know a world where she wasn't wanted, this was hers. All of it. Hard-won and real, and worth every moment of doubt and fear and struggle it had taken to build. The sun would sink toward the horizon, painting everything gold, and Jacob would look up from whatever he was doing and smile at her, that private smile that was hers alone, and she would smile back. And in that moment, with dust settling and dinner waiting, and the life she'd built rising around her like a shelter against the wind, Nora Brennan would know exactly what it felt like to finally, impossibly, be home.